Hi, Mark Speed here. Today I want to talk about the fastest way to disprove the modern tithing requirement that so many preachers try to put on their congregations. In other words, how to talk to a person who believes that the modern believer, the New Testament believer, is required to give 10% of their money to the church. There's a very quick way to disprove that argument and show a person that they really don't have a scriptural leg to stand on. All you have to do is say to them, I will be more than happy to tithe the way anyone in the Bible tithed. Just show me which scriptural example you would like me to follow of a person in the Bible who tithed. Now, when you say this to a person who believes that tithing is for today, you're probably going to throw them for a little bit of a loop because they've never thought this way before. Because they've only been thinking in terms of taking Malachi 3:10 out of context and twisting it, because that's what their preachers do. So they're going to have to think for a second. So you can help them out a little bit. You can say, I've looked all through the Bible as carefully as I can, and you can say, I've only found 3 people or groups of people in the Bible who tithed. One is Abraham. The second is the Old Testament Israelites living under the Old Testament law. And the third is the Pharisees, who are also Old Testament Israelites living under the Old Testament law. Take your pick. Choose one of these 3 people or groups of people that you would like me to emulate in my tithing. So you see that right away, you've shown the person that there is actually no scriptural example of a New Testament believer after the death and resurrection of Christ tithing or being commanded to tithe. All right? So if they don't see the error of their ways immediately already, they've been taught by their preachers, oh, Abraham tithed, so we should tithe. So my guess is that they would probably go for Abraham first if they're going to follow you along in your line of reasoning here and play the game if they don't already realize the error of their belief. They're going to say, okay, you should tithe like Abraham tithed. And then you simply say, all right, how many times in his life did Abraham tithe? Did Abraham tithe regularly on his income? The Bible says Abraham had lots of silver, lots of gold, lots of wealth, lots of income. Did he ever tithe on that? How many times in his life did Abraham tithe? They may not know the answer. Well, the answer is once. He only tithed once in his whole life. And then ask the person, did Abraham tithe that one time on his regular income or on his personal wealth? No, he tithed on the spoils of war. So you say to the person, I'll be more than happy to tithe the way Abraham tithed. I'll just make sure I tithe only one time in my whole life, maximum, and if I tithe, I'll make sure it's on the spoils of war. If I ever take over another country or another person's stuff in battle, I'll make sure I give 10% of it to God one time. So I'll be happy to tithe the way Abraham tithed. So now, if the person already doesn't see the error of their ways and they want to keep following you, they might say, okay, well, Jesus said we should tithe. So you say, okay, did Jesus tell us to tithe? Please show me in the Bible where Jesus told us to tithe. And you'll see that Jesus didn't command us to tithe. What he did was he commended the Pharisees for tithing. Now, the Pharisees were Old Testament Jews living under the Old Testament law. And as such, they did not tithe money, even though they had money. The Pharisees had money. The Bible says they were lovers of money. They had money, but they did not tithe money because the Old Testament law did not command the tithing of money. The Old Testament law only commanded the tithing of agricultural products and livestock for those who grew agricultural products and had livestock. If you were a carpenter like Jesus, you didn't tithe because you earned money. See, the Old Testament law system was set up way back when to be a system for a nation, Israel, whose God was God, a sovereign nation. Now, it was a lot harder to follow the law once they came under Roman rule, but the Pharisees were still trying to do that, and so they tithed their agricultural products, their little spices that they grew in their backyard, trying to be very nitpicky and detail-oriented in following the Old Testament law. And they told Jesus this. They said, Jesus, we're good guys. We tithe our mint and our cumin and our little spices from our backyard gardens or our windowsills or whatever. And Jesus said, that's good. You should do that because you're supposed to be an example to the Israelite people of following the Old Testament law. So if somebody tries to say to you, hey, Jesus told us we should tithe, bring them to the passage in the Bible and say, please show me where Jesus said we should tithe. I will be happy to tithe the way that Jesus said the Pharisees should tithe. And then you show them where it says the Pharisees were telling Jesus, we tithe mint and cumin, our little backyard spices that we grow in our little gardens. They didn't tithe money. They had money, but they didn't tithe it. Jesus didn't turn around and tell them, you should tithe money, not these stupid little spices. No, Jesus said you should tithe your spices because you're being nitpicky and trying to obey the Old Testament law, and you should be an example to the Jewish people who are still trying to obey the law. See, Jesus hadn't died yet. How's he supposed to tell the people don't obey the Old Testament law when he hadn't even died yet to make it possible to not have to obey the Old Testament law? So he told the Pharisees, listen, keep obeying the Old Testament law. You should do that as an example to the Jewish people. And in obedience to the Old Testament law, they were tithing agricultural products. They were even being detoriented to the place where they were doing it out of their backyard gardens. So you can tell anybody you're talking to, I will be happy to tithe the way Jesus commended the Pharisees for tithing. I'll be happy to do that. I'll be happy to take anything I grow in my backyard garden and take 10% of it and bring it and plop it in the offering plate at church. No problem. See, by now the person should be able to realize that their only other option is to tell you that you need to tithe like the Old Testament Israelites did under the law. And they realize that if they tell you that, then they have to tell you to obey the whole Old Testament law. And by now they should realize that their preachers have been taking Malachi 3:10 completely out of context. See, Malachi 3:10 was a prophet speaking to Old Testament Israelites living under the law. That's why that verse has the language about cursing in it. Oh, you're under a curse if you don't tithe. Malachi was not talking to modern New Testament believers. He was talking to Israelites living under the law, and God told the Israelites when he gave them the Old Testament law of Moses. He told them right from the beginning, this is the whole deal with the law, guys. You obey all these things, you'll be blessed. You don't obey them, you'll be cursed. So that's why it was appropriate for Malachi to tell the ancient Israelite farmers and ranchers, listen, you guys are under a curse because you're not obeying the Old Testament law of Moses. That was the whole thing about the law. Now, for a modern preacher to turn around and try to tell me that I'm cursed or you're cursed because you're not doing this or that of the Old Testament law is 100% incorrect and ridiculous. The New Testament believer is not cursed for any reason. Jesus became the curse for us. So you see that people who try to insist that tithing is for today simply do not have a scriptural leg to stand on. If they're going to tell you that tithing is for today, then they have to tell you to obey the whole Old Testament law. And if they try to tell you, oh, Abraham tithed, so he was before the law, and that means you have to tithe. And you say, fine, I'll tithe the way Abraham tithed. I'll tithe one time in my whole life on the spoils of war. That's the only people who tithe in the Bible, my friends. And you can say this to a person with gentleness. You don't have to get all argumentative. Sometimes a person will just turn you off and shut off the conversation because they simply do not want to believe that they are wrong. That's okay. That's not your job. Your job is to correct with gentleness, as the Bible says. So I just wanted to give you a strategy today, a simple thing that you can say to people who believe that tithing is for today. Simply say to them, I will gladly tithe the way anyone in the Bible tithed. Just tell me which biblical example you want me to follow. And what's going to happen is the person is going to end up having to tell you to obey the Old Testament law or to tithe one time in your whole life on the spoils of war like Abraham did. That's all there is to it. Thanks for listening.